Hello again, and thanks for joining me for our sixth online class here at Second Pres, looking at C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. Our time together is growing short with only this class and one final video class next week before we meet for our afternoon tea with Screwtape on November 29th from 4 to 5 p.m. on Zoom for our second and final discussion class. I hope you can join me for that discussion on November 29th. Email me at screwtapequestions@outlook.com if you wish to be a part of our final discussion of this wonderful book, or if you have any particular questions or topics you'd like us to discuss. And speaking of time, we'll look this week in depth at one of my favorite letters, letter 21, as we discuss another aspect of the Screwtape Letters that makes it such an engaging and challenging read, and that is C.S. Lewis's use of his sharp and sometimes quite biting wit to shine a well-deserved light on our human foibles. He hits so close to home in this area that I wonder if something like this happened to you during your read. You were reading along in the book, enjoying it, laughing, chuckling, and then suddenly you'd hit one of these letters that makes you pause, put the book down as you secretly look around to see if anyone's watching, and then you wonder aloud, wait, he's not talking about me, is he? This is a constant event in the Screwtape Letters when I read it. This class will probably have you asking that a lot too, as we delve deeper into Screwtape and our petty annoyances. We've had one example of this already in class 4, when we briefly looked at letter 17 and Screwtape's advice to Wormwood about emphasizing the gluttony of delicacy. And it's often these bits, these examples of our human foibles and our petty annoyances that remain with the reader long after putting down the Screwtape Letters. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this on the 29th. But before we dive into today's class, I cannot pass up the opportunity to ask if anyone else has been hearing Screwtape in the news lately during the past 2 weeks. As of this recording, President Trump has yet to concede the race. And I read yesterday how one of his allies, Roger Stone, who's leading the Stop the Steal campaign, told CNN that those who deny that Trump won the election are the same as those who denied the Holocaust. Seriously, Screwtape must be rejoicing at all the noise coming out of Washington right now. Remember why Screwtape praised noise? Because noise alone defends us from silly qualms, despairing scruples, and impossible desires. Well, let's hope that by our tea time, the noise will be over, or at least greatly diminished, but enough of that. This class continues our discussion from last class about time, and here we look at what it means for us to be in time from a different angle. All the ways evil can use our being in time to its advantage. Lewis, through Screwtape, revisits in several letters these more unfortunate aspects of our being temporal creatures and how evil can use that to emphasize our petty annoyances. Well, let's start with letter 25. In letter 25, Screwtape is helping Wormwood work through his problems with his patient that were caused by the patient's recent repentance. You'll remember that book that he really enjoyed and the walk that he really liked, and also his growing relationship with his new girlfriend and their family. Remember, they are not only Christians, but the worst kind of Christians in Screwtape's opinion. They model God's love so effectively that even their dog and cat are tainted with it. Well, to mount a counterattack, Screwtape advises Wormwood to work on all humans' horror of the same old thing. The horror of the same old thing is one of the most valuable passions we have produced in the human heart, an endless source of heresies in religion, folly in counsel, infidelity in marriage, and inconstancy in friendship. The humans live in time and experience reality successively. To experience much of it, therefore, they must experience many different things. In other words, they must experience change. And since they need change, the enemy, being a hedonist at heart, has made change pleasurable to them, just as he has made eating pleasurable. Well, let me interrupt Screwtape for just a second and notice the reemergence of a previously discussed theme of how pleasure is God's creation. And in this example, God, being a hedonist at heart, has created us so that we find pleasure in change, just as we find pleasure in eating. Screwtape will continue and talk about how God wants to balance our love of change with our love of permanence. And Screwtape cites two examples, the different seasons, winter, spring, summer, fall, which are both always new, yet always repeating. And for those of us in liturgical churches, the church year itself, which we'll talk a bit about at the end of this class. And in describing the church year, he writes to Wormwood, they changed from a feast to a fast, but it is the same feast as before. Well, so far so good, right? But let's look at Screwtape's counterattack and the power of the horror of the same old thing. Screwtape continues. Now, just as we pick out and exaggerate the pleasure of eating to produce gluttony, so we pick out this natural pleasantness of change and twist it into a demand for absolute novelty. This demand is entirely our workmanship. If we neglect our duty, men will be not only contented, but transported by the mixed novelty and familiarity of snowdrops this January, sunrise this morning, plum pudding this Christmas. Here we revisit an earlier theme of the Screwtape Letters, that evil can only mock, it cannot make. Evil has to twist our God-given pleasure that comes from change into something it was never meant to be, a desire for absolute novelty. How many of us have fallen prey to this desire, this horror of the same old thing? The advertising business lives off this desire, always promising us something new, something original. But even scarier, Screwtape explains how the constant demand for new things can often lead to an added bonus from evil's perspective, and that is it falls subject to the law of the diminishing return of pleasure, that as you demand more and more novelty, you lose any sense of pleasure from the novelty. That is a comment that has real-world connections to the danger of all forms of addiction. But I do think here that 2020 could actually help us work against evil's push for all things new, especially this holiday season. While we are all going to have very different Thanksgivings and Christmas experiences because of COVID, I'm hopeful that people will actually discover the love of the same old thing as we're able to have at least some of our beloved holiday traditions. Let's look at another letter, another example of how Screwtape uses this demand for novelty. And in letters 27, he introduces Wormwood to the usefulness, again from evil's perspective, of what he calls the historical point of view. Let's read how Screwtape describes this particular foible. But in the intellectual climate which we have at least succeeded in producing throughout Western Europe, you needn't bother about that. And here, Wormwood had expressed a fear that the patient might read a book of an old author that had a truth that was being discussed at this time. But Screwtape continues, don't be afraid of that, because only the learned read old books now. And we have now so dealt with the learned that they are, of all men, the least likely to acquire wisdom by doing it. We have done this by inculcating the historical point of view. The historical point of view, put briefly, means that when a learned man is presented with any statement in an ancient author, the one question he never asks is whether it is true. He asks who influenced the ancient writer, and how far the statement is consistent with what he said in other books, and what phase in the writer's development or in the general history of thought it illustrates, and how it affected later writers, and how often it's been misunderstood, especially by the learned man's own colleagues, and what the general course of criticism on it has been for the last 10 years, and what is the present state of the question. Again, I'm going to interrupt Screwtape for a second and point out Lewis's own self-referential humor here. He was, after all, an inkling, and along with Tolkien especially, it's not surprising to see him pointing out the importance of ancient writers. Both of these men, their whole scholarship was on the old texts, especially those writing the myths that Lewis and Tolkien both loved. Let's continue with Screwtape. To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge, to anticipate that what he said could possibly modify your thoughts or your behavior, this would be rejected as unutterably simple-minded. And since we cannot deceive the whole human race all the time, it is most important thus to cut every generation off from all others. For where learning makes a free commerce between the ages, there's always the danger that the characteristic errors of one may be corrected by the characteristic truths of another. But thanks be to our Father and the historical point of view, great scholars are now as little nourished by the past as the most ignorant mechanic who holds that history is bunk. Here we see the power of this human foible, this regard that our current knowledge is superior to that of the past generation. Lewis, in other writings, described this differently, calling it chronological snobbery. And that phrase perhaps gets to the heart of the matter. We are snobs when it comes to our learning, and we often don't recognize it. While it's true that the modern mind does find new ways of understanding the world, for example, in the sciences, it does not follow that the ancient mind was always worse at understanding the world and should therefore always be disregarded. Tolkien actually was famous for his reverse snobbery. He complained that nothing good came out of literature after the 13th century. He was, after all, the expert on Beowulf. But while I love Tolkien, he was definitely a curmudgeon. But I raise this to challenge you this Advent season, perhaps, and go back and read authors from many generations past. I reread A Christmas Carol each Advent, having started reading it to my youngest daughter, Mary, as part of her Advent preparation when she was young. And although I've read it several times before, each year, I find myself amazed by the insights captured by Dickens in a work that's now almost 200 years old. If you're attending the afternoon tea, be prepared to discuss what ancient works you like to read, or email them to me at screwtapequestions@outlook.com. I'll end this section noting the dangers that Lewis points out that are inherent in the historical point of view. Because when generations are cut off from those that came before, the later generations may also be cut off from the truths of those earlier generations that would otherwise help correct the errors of the later generation. Those who don't understand history, after all, are doomed to repeat it. Or to borrow from Lewis's contemporary George Orwell, things can be even worse when we simply rewrite history based on our whim. That warning has added weight right now, especially when one of our political parties seems intent on taking what we all know to be true and labeling it false or fake. Just the other day, I heard the Senator-elect Tommy Tuberville from Alabama, the former college football coach, at his victory speech, talking about the influence of his grandfather on his political life. And he said that he was influenced by his grandfather, who stormed Normandy's beaches to rid Europe of socialism and communism. Wait a minute, Tommy. The Nazis were not socialists. They might have been called the National Socialist Party, but it was a fascist regime. And if you don't remember, we actually were allied with the communists during World War II. Well, if my grandfather were alive today, who also fought in World War II, who also coached football, but who also taught history, he'd be triple ashamed of that comment. Well, don't get me started on the anti-intellectualism running rampant in today's politics. We need to finish up with this class. But before we get to letter 21, I want to take a quick detour to letter 26, which gives us perhaps the best example of Lewis's biting humor when he describes our petty annoyances. In letter 26, Screwtape is explaining to Wormwood the problem of unselfishness. He notes with some pride the work of our philological arm in substituting the negative unselfishness for the positive charity. And in doing so, we realize Lewis is trying to tell us something, that we need to recapture this virtue of charity while warning us against the actual negative of being uncharitable. Lewis does so in the form of a very funny example from Screwtape that he describes as a game. And let's read it together. When once a sort of official, legal, or nominal unselfishness has been established as a rule for the keeping of which their emotional resources have died away and their spiritual resources have not yet grown, the most delightful results follow. In discussing any joint action, it becomes obligatory that A should argue in favor of B's supposed wishes and against his own, while B does the opposite. It is often impossible to find out either party's real wishes. With luck, they end by doing something that neither wants, while each feels a glow of self-righteousness and harbors a secret claim to preferential treatment for the unselfishness shown and a secret grudge against the other for the ease with which the sacrifice has been accepted. What I want to know is how Lewis, writing in the 1940s, can capture human nature so brilliantly. Oh, wait, Carter, heal thyself. Seriously, right now, you can probably remember the last time you had this argument with your friend or family member or your spouse. What do you want to eat tonight? Oh, I don't care. What do you want to eat? Oh, no, 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 no. It doesn't matter to me. You pick. No, 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 no. You're being too kind. You should get to decide, and so on and so forth until you're eating a meal neither of you wanted to eat. But wait, this gets worse. Let's go to the actual game that Screwtape describes. Later on, you can venture on what may be called the generous conflict illusion. This game is best played with more than 2 players in a family with grown-up children, for example. Uh-oh, this sounds a little close to home. Something quite trivial, like having tea in the garden, is proposed. One member takes care to make it quite clear, though not in so many words, that he would rather not, but is of course prepared to do so out of unselfishness. The others instantly withdraw their proposal, ostensibly through their unselfishness, but really because they don't want to be used as a sort of lay figure on which the first speaker practices petty altruisms. But he is not going to be done out of this debauch of unselfishness either. He insists on doing what the others want. They insist on doing what he wants. Passions are aroused. Soon someone is saying, very well then, I won't have any tea at all. And a real quarrel ensues with bitter resentments on both sides. You see how it's done. Oh, Jack, you're hitting way too close to home with this one. Well, we are now ready for Lewis's pièce de résistance in capturing human foibles and our petty annoyances in letter 21, where he uses a spiritual scalpel to dissect what a person is really saying when she makes a claim about my time. Go ahead and open up to letter 21 so you can read along to John Cleese. But while you're doing that, I want to offer this teaser by showing a clip from a movie that I bet has never been cited in any class at Second Pres before. The great theological masterpiece of the 1980s, early 80s, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. This clip starts right after Spicoli, our burned out Sean Penn beach bum, has ordered pizza to be delivered in the middle of his high school class taught by Mr. Hand. Let's see what happens.
Mr. Spicoli, you're on dangerous ground here. You're causing a major disturbance on my time.
I've been thinking about this, Mr. Hand. If I'm here and you're here, doesn't that make it our time? Certainly there's nothing wrong with a little feast on our time.
You're absolutely right, Mr. Spicoli. It is our time. Yours, mine, and everyone else's in this room. But it is my class. Hamilton, Brandt, Kornfeld, up front. Mr. Spicoli has been kind enough to bring us a snack. Be my guest. Help yourselves. Get a good one.
Well, I'm not sure how well Fast Times holds up as a movie now, and I'm certainly not going to recommend it. And it's certainly probably still as problematic now as it was then. But I do love the scene when Spicoli turns philosopher and argues with Mr. Hand about our time. But enough of frivolous pop culture references. Let's get back to John Cleese's reading of letter 21. I'm going to just hit the high points this time on the screen, so please follow along in your book, and then we'll come back and discuss it at the end.
Letter 21 My dear Wormwood, yes. A period of sexual temptation is an excellent time for working in a subordinate attack on the patient's peevishness. It may even be the main attack as long as he thinks it is the subordinate one. But here, as in everything else, the way must be prepared for your moral assault by darkening his intellect. Men are not angered by mere misfortune, but by misfortune conceived as injury. And the sense of injury depends on the feeling that a legitimate claim has been denied. The more claims on life, therefore, that your patient can be induced to make, the more often he will feel injured and, as a result, ill-tempered. Now, you will have noticed that nothing throws him into a passion so easily as to find a tract of time which he reckoned on having at his own disposal unexpectedly taken from him. It is the unexpected visitor when he looks forward to a quiet evening, or the friend's talkative wife turning up when he looked forward to a tete-a-tete with a friend that throws him out of gear. Now, he is not yet so uncharitable or slothful that these small demands on his courtesy are in themselves too much for him. They anger him because he regards his time as his own and feels that it is being stolen. You must therefore zealously guard in his mind the curious assumption, my time is my own. Let him have the feeling that he starts each day as the lawful possessor of 24 hours. Let him feel as a grievous tax that portion of this property which he has to make over to his employers, and as a generous donation that further portion which he allows to religious duties. But what he must never be permitted to doubt is that the total from which these deductions have been made was, in some mysterious sense, his own personal birthright. You have here a delicate task. The assumption which you want him to go on making is so absurd that if once it is questioned, even we cannot find a shred of argument in its defense. The man can neither make nor retain one moment of time. It all comes to him by pure gift. He might as well regard the moon and the sun as his chattels. He is also, in theory, committed to a total service of the enemy. And if the enemy appeared to him in bodily form and demanded that total service for even one day, he would not refuse. He would be greatly relieved if that one day involved nothing harder than listening to the conversation of a foolish woman. And he would be relieved almost to the pitch of disappointment if, for only 1/2 hour in that day, the enemy said, now you may go and amuse yourself. Now, if he thinks about his assumption for a moment, even he is bound to realize that he is actually in this situation every day. When I speak of preserving this assumption in his mind, therefore, the last thing I mean you to do is to furnish him with arguments in its defense. There aren't any. Your task is purely negative. Don't let his thoughts come anywhere near it. Wrap a darkness around it. And in the center of that darkness, let his sense of ownership in time lie silent, uninspected, and operative. The sense of ownership in general is always to be encouraged. The humans are always putting up claims to ownership which sound equally funny in heaven and in hell, and we must keep them doing so. Much of the modern resistance to chastity comes from men's belief that they own their bodies, those vast and perilous estates pulsing with the energy that made the world, in which they find themselves without their consent and from which they are ejected at the pleasure of another. It is as if a royal child, whom his father has placed for love's sake in titular command of some great province under the real rule of wise counselors, should come to fancy he really owns the cities, the forests, and the court in the same way as he owns the bricks on the nursery floor. We produce this sense of ownership not only by pride but by confusion. We teach them not to notice the different senses of the possessive pronoun, the finely graded differences that run from my boots through my dog, my servant, my wife, my father, my master, and my country to my God. They can be taught to reduce all these senses to that of my boots, the my of ownership, even in the nursery. A child can be taught to mean by my teddy bear, not the old imagined recipient of affection to whom it stands in a special relation, for that is what the enemy will teach them to mean if we're not careful, but the bear I can pull to pieces if I like. And at the other end of the scale, we have taught men to say, my God, in a sense not really very different from my boots, meaning the God on whom I have a claim for my distinguished services and whom I exploit from the pulpit. And all the time, the joke is that the word mine, in its fully possessive sense, cannot be uttered by a human being about anything. In the long run, either our Father or the enemy will say mine of everything that exists, and especially of each man. They will find out in the end, never fear, to whom their time, their souls, and their bodies really belong. Certainly not to them, whatever happens. At present, the enemy says mine of everything on the pedantic, legalistic ground that he made it. Our Father hopes in the end to say mine of all things on the more realistic and dynamic ground of conquest. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.
What a great letter. It's another of these letters that has stuck with me since I first heard it all those years ago, and it really serves as a great reminder of my own pettiness. Before we unpack it, note how at the very beginning, Screwtape picks up on an earlier theme and says to prepare Wormwood's way, he must first darken the patient's intellect. He's not going to actually teach the patient anything useful. He's just going to confuse him about what he's really saying when he says, my time. Well, to understand this letter, it all starts with Screwtape's comment that we aren't angered by mere misfortune, but by misfortune conceived as injury. So when the unexpected happens, we don't embrace it or accept it. No, we perceive it as an injury because the unexpected has robbed me of my time. Again, notice evil's task here is not to give us arguments as to why my time is my own, and therefore I have a right to be injured by the unexpected. No, Screwtape admits there are not any defenses. Again, the task is to confuse the patient, and as he says here, to wrap a darkness about it. Lewis is at his most insightful and biting when he says evil's talk is always to encourage our sense of ownership and then walks us through the progression of ownership. Allow this explanation to sit with you. What do you mean when you say my friend or even my spouse or my child or my God? Don't we all, when we allow our thoughts to be wrapped in darkness, reduce all things to this sense of of ownership? Well, there is a biblical counterweight to ownership. And to discuss it, let's talk Tolkien for just a minute. Remember Denethor, who we talked about in the last class. In The Lord of the Rings, Denethor was the steward of Gondor, a title given to his ancestors to guard and protect the throne until the return of the king. In Tolkien's story, the king's line in Gondor had failed, but there was hope that one day it might be restored. And while the people waited, the stewards took over the rule of Gondor, and they were given 3 tasks. They took the responsibility for taking good care of the kingdom in the king's absence. They were the ultimate accountability to the king for carrying out that responsibility. And they were called upon to surrender to the king's authority upon the king's return. But this tendency that Screwtape illustrated towards ownership befell the stewards, and ultimately Denethor in his time viewed himself as the rightful ruler and owner of Gondor in the place of the king, even after the king had returned. It's here that Tolkien gives us a powerful image of what true stewardship should be like as a Christian, because we, like Denethor, are also stewards of all that we've been given. All that we've been given has been given to us by God, and the tasks are equally true for us. We are to take good care of God's kingdom and ultimately surrender that authority back to God when God returns. I think stewardship campaigns that focus only on money are asking actually too little of us. We are to be good stewards of all things while we wait for God's return. Most importantly, this is something my former priest, Reverend Tim Taylor, taught me in Nashville, that above all else, we are to be good stewards of the gospel. That is the good news found in Jesus Christ. And we are to take a role in making sure that gospel survives into tomorrow. How different would your day look if you woke up tomorrow morning and committed yourself to being a good steward of the gospel, at least for the next 24 hours? Well, all this talk of waiting for God's return is providential because we're getting ready for the season of Advent, the season of the church. Again, thank you, God, for being a hedonist and giving us this sense of newness and permanence in the church year, where we set aside time to focus on waiting for God's return. Let's challenge each other this Advent to counter this tendency towards ownership with a focus on true stewardship and see what comes out of it. Well, returning to Lewis, he also gives us our own counterattack, if you will, our own defense against the dark arts of ownership. Because remember how Screwtape writes in this letter that the human is also in theory committed to total service of the enemy. And if the enemy appeared to him in bodily form and demanded that total service for even one day, he would not refuse. Now, I take Screwtape's comment about our commitment to Christ in theory as a bit of a snide comment. Sure, we pay lip service to serving God, but do we really mean it? What would happen if we were to begin each day acknowledging that the next 24 hours are a gift and it's something we neither possessed nor had a claim over? What would happen if we followed Jesus's lead as someone who gave up all claims of ownership over his own time and instead gave himself over to God's time and the task of advancing God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven? Well, I'm going to give you some encouragement in the form of a hymn that's one of my favorite hymns, in fact. So let's listen to it together. This is what total service looks like, taking up the cross and following Christ. And this hymn reminds me of the great paradox that Screwtape has been struggling with throughout the book, that by giving our life over to Christ, we actually find it, and we actually find abundant life in doing so. This is a great counter to the idea of ownership that Screwtape wants to encourage. We meet it by taking up our cross, or thinking of the idea of stewardship. We do not ultimately possess the life we've been given. We've been given the life to serve the one who loves us and died for us and came back to create the new kingdom through us. Well, remember, we'll have one more video class before our final Zoom discussion on the 29th. Email me if you wish to participate or have questions you'd like to discuss. As always, I'm grateful for your spending time with me for this class, and I pray that it has given you strength and encouragement as you go into your day. Now, go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and until we meet again, I remain your affectionate brother in Christ, Carter.